The Honourable Member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As always, it's an honour to represent the people of the great region of Northern Ontario, which latitudinally is south of the Nahanni watershed, but it still represents the great north of Canada. At the beginning, I will just lay out for the record what we're talking about, Senate Bill S5, which is the Natsicho National Park Reserve boundaries that are being discussed here, which is they're adjacent to and north of the Nahanni National Park Reserve, and a beautiful area of this country. I'd like to put on the record that my dear friend Jack Layton always spoke of the impact that the Nahanni left on him when he visited it a number of years ago. For him, it was a transformative moment in seeing the great beauty of Canada. I think Canadians who are watching this are asking themselves about this government's appalling attitude towards the environment and the games that have been played again and again and again with the serious issues of catastrophic climate change that are facing us, that when we ask questions in the House about, for example, the Intergovernmental UN Panel on Climate Change and their findings, we generally hear laughter and ridicule from the Conservative backbenches, as though this is something that was made up, or as the present Prime Minister once said, that it's some kind of a socialist plot, that the world is round. Yes, he might think it's a socialist plot, but it's real, and that we all live on this one planet. So when we're talking about how the decision of this park reserve was made, we need to look at it in terms of this rip and ship philosophy that this Conservative government has. I represent vast mining regions. Some of the largest gold and copper, deepest copper base metal mine in the world is in my region. We have diamond mines. We're used to resource development in my region. But what we see from this government is this kind of it's like a gambler's addiction to resources with absolutely no interest in the future, whether it's the value-added processing or whether it's the protection of environment that they believe that's written into that what should be written into any development project is that our children and grandchildren carry the cost of the quickest way of getting resources out of the ground, whether it's the bitumen and the tar sands or whether it's open strip mining, that the environment of this country should be the ones that are paying the debt. So we're looking at this issue of this land reserve that was set aside, and I'm going to talk a bit about public process and the scam that public process is when you're dealing with very large interests who decide that they would put their own financial interests above the interests of the public good. I want to talk again as we talk about this very important protected area and the need to have these protected areas in Canada. It's not to say that there's not going to be development. We are a development nation. We have enormous geography, but we have to choose to put value on the watersheds, on the areas that need to be set aside so that we can have the protection. I'm thinking, Mr. Speaker, that this past week when the UN report on the fifth and final report, Intergovernmental Report on Climate Change, is absolutely shocking. That they say we're now at the point of facing irreversible impacts on people, that these impacts are already being observed, including the rising sea levels, a more acidic ocean, melting glaciers and Arctic sea ice, and increasing erratic weather. And again, this government is like a gambling addict that doesn't seem to notice or care that we're mortgaging our future generations so that we can get the quickest buck out of the ground as we can without it being sustainable, without it having a long-term sustainable economic plan. We have the means to limit climate change. The Chairman Rajendra Pachauri said the solutions are many and allow for continued economic and human development. All we need is the will to change. Mr. Speaker, I'm not one of those who are a pessimist about the future. I look at what our country did in the Second World War when a country of 10 million people raised the fourth largest Navy in the world, the fourth largest Air Force in the world, fed Europe because we saw a threat. And yet I see this complete lazy disinterest in addressing the ultimate issue of our generation and our children and our grandchildren's generation, which is the march towards irreversible climate change. Over the last 6 decades, Canada has become warmer. You can see it in any region of this country, the erratic weather patterns that have changed substantially. It is the rise in temperature has been the 1.5 degrees Celsius between 1950 and 2010. That doesn't come from the Democrats. That doesn't come from a socialist plot. That comes from a federal government report that talked about the unique risks Canadians are facing because the impacts on irreversible climate change will be felt first and foremost in Canada's far north. And representing the great region of James Bay, Ontario, where the land is sitting about 2 feet above sea level, and we have huge issues of flooding at the best of times. The issue of not planning for the future of this region in terms of if we are dealing with moving towards irreversible climate change, it will be catastrophic. So let's look at this government's commitment to the environment when it comes to this park. We're going to play a little game. We're going to give you 3 options: door number 1, door number 2, door number 3, and ask the people back home to figure out what door the Conservatives open. So under door number 1, we had a park reserve of 6,450 square kilometers that was focused on protecting the watershed values. Door number 2, well, it was diminished. It was 5,770 square kilometers. So it had lessened the environmental protection and allowed more mining options. Door number 3, the smallest reserve, 4,840 square kilometers, that was built around ensuring that the mining companies have what they needed and whatever interests they wanted, and the rest, well, you could preserve that if you want. So out of the 1,600 submissions, only 2 asked for door number 3, the choice of ensuring maximum mining interests in this Nahanni region with the minimum of conservation growth. So I'm going to ask folks back home, what do you think the Conservative government chose? Well, the answer is obvious. They chose door number 3, the one that had no support locally, and the one that did not preserve the environment, and the one that offered the maximum benefit to the mining interests. It speaks to their philosophy, Mr. Speaker, of this rip and ship philosophy that these incredible natural wonders that we have been blessed with in Canada, that they exist as a backdrop. If you want to strip mine it and you want to dump it, why not here? As good a place as any. And we don't believe that in the New Democratic Party. Again, representing a region that is heavily based on mining. We know that our industries do create an environmental impact, and we want to work to ensure that we have the highest environmental standards. And when I talk to mining interests about how they see the direction of Canada going, for example, when this government cut the Navigable Waters Act and cut the water protection to 99.97% of the lakes in this country, I asked people in the mining sector, well, you guys must have thought that was really great. And they said, no, that's not what we want. We want peace on the ground in terms of our ability to do our resource development. We want to be able to say to Canadians, we can do this right. You establish the rules for environment, we will live by them. That's what I've been, in all the conversations I've had with mining interests. The other that I hear from the mining sector is they say, we want to, if there's a role for the federal government, it's how do we ensure that we've got training for the large percentage of unemployed First Nation youth who are in the territories like the Ring of Fire, so that they can become employed and part of the economy so that we can actually move together. But what we see again and again and again is this myopic belief that we'll just let the environment pay whatever price in order to fast-track development, even when the development is actually not sustainable because we're not getting the long-term benefit from the jobs. If you represent a region where people fly in and fly out, and it's an open pit, and there's no plan for value added, I'll tell you, there's many mining families I know, you ask them, they say, leave it in the ground. Leave it in the ground. It's our capital for our future generations. If we're not going to mine it properly, and if we're not going to get the maximum benefits so that our communities can grow, then leave it in the ground. But that's not the attitude of this government. It's get it out, get it as fast as they can, and get it on a boat to China where the value-added processing will happen in another jurisdiction, not here. And we don't agree with that. Now, going back, Mr. Speaker, on this National Park Reserve. The government presents us with the least favorable option. So are you going to vote against the least favorable option? Well, no, you're not, because we'd rather have some of this protected than nothing. But this government needs to understand, if they're going to have credibility on the international stage when it comes to the issues of climate change, when we see what our European partners are doing, they have to start sending some signals that they actually do care about the environment. Steve Ketfwe, the former Premier of the Northwest Territories, he said the way the boundaries were drawn is that the Prime Minister chose to put the mining interests above environmental interests. He said, quote, "Unfortunately, I think the Prime Minister has let Canadians down. This is not a national park. It is a joke." Those are serious words from a former Premier of the Northwest Territories. He goes on to say that the Prime Minister has taken the heart right out of it. The middle of this reserve is carved out so that mining can happen dead center in the middle of this proposed national park. He then says the park boundary proposed in Bill S5 will not achieve this conservation goal because it leaves out much of the important habitat for woodland caribou, including critical calving and breeding grounds, as well as for grizzly bears and Dall sheep. And it leaves out a significant part of the Little Nahanni River, which is a major tributary of the South Nahanni River and includes some of the most important habitat in the area. Now, what you'll also hear from the government, their line, one of my favorite lines from them is record investments. Whenever they're cutting money, they say record investments, record investments, record investments in First Nation education, record investments in water. Go to any of those communities, they'll just laugh and say, what record investments? So, of course, they'll say, oh, but we have record investments in Parks Canada. We value Parks Canada. So they promised us $391 million in Budget 2013. So again, folks back home, $391 million, a fairly impressive number. How much did they actually spend? $1 million. Ooh, that's not even close. Then last year they spent $4 million. Oh, we're still not even near what they promised. Oh, right, the rest of the $380-some million, well, we'll wait till after the next election, and the next government will have to follow through on that. So we get the ribbon cutting, we get the big announcements, we get the promise on commitment to environment, and none of the money comes forward. We see that in parks, we see the layoff of employees, we see the issue of crumbling infrastructure, and the need to maintain these important jewels, these watersheds that are crucial for maintaining the biodiversity of this country, but also the sense for people internationally who we are. You know, when I'm in the far north of Canada, I meet Europeans regularly. The Europeans who come here because they're fascinated by the beauty, the immense beauty of regions like the Yukon, regions like the Northwest Territories. They come here because this is their view of Canada. There's an enormous economic power to these national parks, because people see that Canada still has them in areas where the rest of the world does not. So we have to put the value back, Mr. Speaker, on saying that these should be protected watersheds. This is not to be anti-development, but development has to be done in a smart and sustainable fashion with a sense of balance. And right now, there is absolutely no balance with how this government is approaching resource development. Now, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the options that were laid out, as I said, the three options, only two submissions asked to support the weakest option, but that's the one the government chose. Now, anybody who's been involved in public consultation process will tell you, more often than not, it's actually kind of it's a shell game. When there's a mega project to be developed, well, now they've changed the rules. You have to prove why you should even be able to have public comment. But public comment is a box that's ticked off. When they've decided they're going to go ahead with a major development project, they just have to tick off the box. First Nation consultation, tick off the box. I remember a toxic waste incinerator they were going to build in Northern Ontario on the territory of the Algonquin-Temiskaming First Nation. I was working with the Algonquin Nation. The last night before the consultation period ended, the very last night, they showed up in the community with their dog and pony show. And the government of Ontario said, excellent. You've done consultation. The Algonquin said, well, we'll see you in court, and that was the end of that. That is not consultation. And you will also see that this is a government that is almost standing alone in the world in its opposition to the push for the UN to the issue of free, prior, informed consent on the development of projects, because there are constitutional provisions that have to be protected. So when we see a conservation plan that could have made this government look so good, I mean, they really, I'm sorry, you know, I know I'm not a friend of theirs, but my God, they could use some loving now on the environment. They could use a little bit of credibility, just a fig leaf. I mean, like, just give us something. So, like it's almost like I'm not even going to beat on them there. It's just so over the top with their attitude. But they could have done something. They could have said, okay, we're not going to go with door number 1, which is maximum protection. And we're not going to go with door number 3, minimum. We'll go with door number 2. We'll just balance it. But balance to them is a word that sounds like weakness or socialism or extremism or radicalism. That's their idea of balance. So no, they're not going to choose balance. They're going to choose the weakest environmental protection with the maximum exploitation of resources. Mr. Speaker, we will be supporting this bill because we'd rather have something than nothing at this point. But certainly in 2015, you will see a new Democratic government having to do so much work to fix the disaster that they've left on our environment. Thank you very much.